Okay, Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa hlul uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Um, as I mentioned, really appreciate you all for joining today, and to those who will be listening to the recording, thank you for taking the time, and jazakallah khair to everyone who is joining live. And inshallah, whenever I have a small group, I tend to unmute the people so that there can be some interaction, some engagement there. Feel free to engage as much as you feel comfortable. There's no pressure, but I will make that adjustment, inshallah. And we will also pace ourselves so that there's a good balance of engagement and um, yeah, progress with what we have planned today. Okay. So those of you who just joined in, we had asked everyone to please share where they're joining from and your role in healthcare. Jazakallah khair. All right. Okay. So there's always a risk that when we have everybody with the option to mute or unmute, we may have some distractions. So just be mindful of that, inshallah. Jazakallah khair. So before I even get started, I wanted to share a quick reflection. And some of you may have heard me talk about this before. For some of you, for many of you, I think today, you may not have heard me talk about this before. So I'll just take you back memory lane um, on my own personal journey just over 10 years ago. My wife and I were both in residency. She was, 2 hours away. We had a 1 year old when by the time she started, and the distance was not fun. Driving back and forth, trying to make it work. And then professionally, at the stage of residency, I was, alhamdulillah, making progress, ended up as a chief resident, had some interesting leadership challenges related to the fact that I was a minority uh, by every measure um, at the time. So I ended up in a family medicine conference because I did do family medicine residency, and one of the faculty there was drawn to his approach. So I sat down with him and we had a heart-to-heart conversation about my leadership challenges. And he asked me a few different questions, and he ended up finding out that, the situation with my wife and I. And as the conversation evolved, he stopped me and said, "Son, I know you're really worried about this leadership challenge, but it's your situation with your wife and your 1 year old son being apart is something that has much higher stakes than what you're describing. So even though you came to me with this leadership challenge, I want to impress upon you that this is your number one priority to address this, that you will make an intention today to change the course of this. And it may not happen immediately, but it should be something that you intentionally approach. Otherwise, it may never change." And I didn't fully understand the weight of that at that moment in time. I continued on that path. In fact, I went to fellowship for another year, now 8 hours apart. And it got to a point where we couldn't take care of our 1 year old anymore. We had to send him to Nigeria, where my wife and I are originally from. And, our family was pretty much across the pond, as it were, two large continents, because we were making some choices that were not necessarily serving our need, at least in the moment. Fast forward to finishing fellowship, ended up in a position as a hospitalist, and second pregnancy, twin pregnancy, complicated pregnancy. And most of you who are in healthcare understand what that means. Multiple visits to the MFM on a week-to-week basis until they were finally delivered. At the moment of delivery, I was 2 hours away. MFM said we have to deliver them now. They were already in the OR by the time I made it back. We got through that phase with the help of colleagues, of course, supporting, and I had to have the crucial conversations that I had been avoiding. One interesting point at that turn of events was that the conversation I had with the faculty at that conference now became super clear. That the pain that I had allowed myself to continue to go through had become unbearable at that point. So that was when I actually made the intention that, you're out of residency, you're out of fellowship, you're a minority, yes, but you have agency and you just have not been leveraging it. You've been stuck out of your own choice. Almost like the analogy of a dog who is sitting on a nail and is moaning. And everybody's watching the dog sitting on that nail and they don't realize what it's sitting on. And, somebody asks a person who knows, and they said he's sitting on a nail, but the pain is not bad enough for him to get off of it. And when the pain gets bad enough that we realize what's going on, sometimes it's too late. Before that pain even gets to that point, we often have stages of clarity or awareness that tell us that our current situation needs to change, but we oftentimes push it aside. We get in the cycle of the treadmills, without any forward traction, as we say in the SakeenahMD space, or the rat race, which we're very familiar with in healthcare. We just keep showing up because we have to show up for everyone else except for ourselves, except, the core areas of our lives that truly make our true identity, the space of energy management and self-care, the space of our relationships, the space of our deen, and then the space of our work. And there's a reason why work is the last thing. So alhamdulillah, I was able to talk to the attorneys, talk to my bosses, my colleagues, and find out how to actually navigate my way through there, even though I was on a waiver job. I was eventually uprooted to be in the same location as my wife, and alhamdulillah, the rest is history. And I share that because many of us are going through different sticky situations, and it can feel helpless. Sometimes it's related to our deen, which is the foundation of this work that we do. Sometimes it's our relationships. In conversations with colleagues, some will reflect and share that I didn't want to lose everything, which can happen when we don't give it the attention that it deserves. And work keeps sucking all the attention. Sometimes it's in the area of even our own energy levels, and we keep going down this spiral, chronic disease, whatnot. So there's many layers, but what I'm sharing there is I didn't have the opportunity to be mentored or to be coached or to have a trusted party to really share with me in a safe space uh, to make that sincere intention of where I am, wherever I was at that time, and to start making that change before it got to that critical moment. And that's the crux of our conversation today. That's the crux of the work that we do at SakeenahMD and Sakeenah Growth Company. And with that, we'll start with a conscious Bismillah to recenter ourselves and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for Barakah in this space, that whatever insight, whatever comes up for us, whatever we encounter in the conversations that we have today will be useful in helping us to make progress towards our own next best versions on our individual journeys to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
له معقبات من خلفه يحفظونه من أمر الله إن الله لا يغير ما بقوم حتى يغيروا ما بأنفسهم وإذا أراد الله بقوم سوءا فلا مرد له وما لهم من دونه من وال.
So we always begin our sessions with the recitation of the Quran to attract Allah's Barakah. This specific ayah speaks to the conversation we're having today, the conversation around our sense of agency. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spells it out in the Quran in this ayah, which we'll go deeper into. But hold that thought that we have more agency than we always allow ourselves to believe. And that beneath, the sense of a lack of agency, there's many layers, of thoughts, of beliefs, of emotions that are clouding that inaction that's happening. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala dismantles that in this ayah when He says specifically that indeed we will not change the situation of any people until they change themselves. In other explanations of this ayah, until they change what is within themselves or what is within their hearts. And that speaks to all those different layers. So our intention today is to create a space for healthcare colleagues that we share the same faith identity, our deen, alhamdulillah, for guidance, so that we can rethink how we're approaching our work, and more importantly, our whole lives, to explore this workism trap, and then to identify the 4 archetypes of drift, and look at the frame of, misaligned success. And then this idea of prophetic transformation that starts with awareness. And then invite you all to a coaching space that we cultivated specifically for Muslim healthcare professionals in the Sakeenah Growth Company and SakeenahMD ecosystem. So a little bit about myself. Board certified in family medicine and clinical informatics. I have deep roots in healthcare, just like many of us here today. But mostly relevant to this work is my affiliation with the Productive Muslim Company, run by Mohammed Faris, for those of you who know Mohammed Faris, and then additional coaching certifications at the Barakah Hive, and then resilience coaching. And I enjoy running, swimming, and a cup of tea, but not after Salat al-Isha. If you offer me a cup of tea in the evening, I will likely decline. If I take it, I'll just keep it in the fridge till the morning. And that's a snapshot of my family. And this is the crux of our work at Sakeenah Growth Company, which is bridging healthcare excellence with faith, resilience, and lasting impact. And we do that through coaching, through masterclasses on peak performance, and supporting colleagues on their personal and professional journeys, and specifically for leaders as well. I'll share with you a video that really helps us to understand this idea of workism, and the whole idea was started by the gentleman who narrates here. I'll let you hear from him, and then we'll reflect together, inshallah.
Elle Mills always wanted to be a YouTuber. An important question, purpose.
Let's fast forward just a little bit there.
This idea of bragging to people, I had an all-nighter last night. We are essentially the workaholics of the world.
This is Derek. He's a self-professed workaholic, and he recently wrote about why work is making us miserable. There's a psychology behind it. He calls it workism.
Workism is the idea that work is the centerpiece of our identity, the focal point of our lives, and really the organizing principle of society. A lot of people have essentially turned to work to find the very things that they used to seek from traditional religions: transcendence, meaning, community, self-actualization, a totalizing purpose in life. And so I think that in many ways we have essentially made our work our God.
Workism was pioneered by the rich. It started with college-educated elites who were raised to turn their passions into careers.
In the last 35, 40 years, what you've seen is that the rich are choosing to work more. And that is a really ahistorical shift. For the vast majority of history, the rich have always worked less.
Now it's not just the rich who are working more. It's everyone.
You see it trickling down not only in the workplace, but also on social media, with hashtag hustle culture. There's this bombardment of other people's successes so that you're constantly aware that other people have more status than you. And this, I think, is a kind of poison.
So I started uploading consistently because I knew that for every video I posted, I gained subscribers. That is how I gained an audience. Once the numbers started growing faster and faster, I'm like, okay, I need to keep this up for that to continue, or else if I stop, it'll stop. It was not sustainable.
This obsession with being constantly plugged in and looking for meaning from a job is relatively recent.
150 years ago, Americans tended to work on farms. I did what my father did, what my grandfather did, what my great-grandfather did.
A job was just a job. The idea of career advancement didn't exist yet. Then, in the late 20th century, an explosion of big business changed the game.
You had finance take off, you had the beginning of the tech culture. With the invention of bureaucracies and multi-part companies, we invented that which we now call a career, this sort of narrative arc toward a series of acronyms, CEO, CFO, CMO. That is a very modern invention. I think it's fair to say that we've evolved from jobs to careers to callings.
You can actually hear this gospel being preached to the next generation. The single most common piece of career advice in commencement speeches is:
follow your passion.
Love what you do.
Take a chance on doing what you love.
But most of the available jobs in the economy are not designed to stoke passion.
A lot of jobs suck. They're designed to sell stuff to people and make money for their bosses.
And this is where the central problem lies.
I think at the end, we're being sold a false American dream. We're being sold a vision of how life works out for a minuscule few of Americans, and telling all Americans that this is what they should pursue. And it's setting ourselves up for the anxiety and the frustration and the worries and the spiritual and psychological burnout that so many of us are feeling.
Most full-time employees report feeling burnt out on the job. And the WHO recently decided that burnout can now be diagnosed as a medical condition. So if workism is leading to this epidemic, what would it take to change the mentality?
I don't think anyone has ever been able to provide a clear and final answer to the question, how do I balance my life between love and work and family and friends? But here are two answers. The top-down solution is we should change public policy. We should make it easier for people to work less while still making a living wage. But there's also bottom-up solutions. Therapy, Buddha, existentialism.
From my experience, I've been learning to create boundaries for myself to protect my mental health, my career, my privacy.
The work of detaching ourselves and detaching our identities from what it is that we do is the sort of experience that everyone sort of has to figure out on their own. Hey, thanks for watching.
All right. I'm curious if there's any thoughts on the video, and feel free to unmute yourself. I have a few more people who have joined since we started. Zahar here for joining. Welcome. Anyone want to unmute or just type in the chat box what were your thoughts from the video? There are no thoughts. I'm going to throw a question out there. Who can relate to what was shared about workism? Drop a one in the chat box. If not, or you have a different idea, drop it in the chat box as well. Okay, I'm seeing some activity in the chat box now. Many healthcare started because we love what we do. Yes. That said, the jobs start to become overwhelming with many responsibilities that don't seem related to what people signed up for. SubhanAllah. Yeah. I think we're getting to medicine because we think we're getting to doing what we love. Yeah. I think there is some aspect to that. And we can spend the whole session just discussing this. There are a few things to call out from that video. One is that work has become the central organizing identity. I think that's very problematic for us as Muslims, because it then becomes something that we worship, which is another thing he mentioned. Sean says, I would say separating yourself from the work is field dependent. The electronic accessibility of EMRs and having personal sales share with manager. Yeah, it's fun. A trick for me is to never dress publicly as a physician. And it helps me mentally separate and detach from my job and focus more on spouse, father, and community member. Inshallah. Jazakallah khair for sharing. It's interesting and relatable. As a hospitalist, not just I'm battling feelings of burnout and at times looking for ways to pivot all the time. Alhamdulillah. Ya Allah Ta'ala make it easy for you, Dr. Khan, and all of us. Yeah. Jazakallah khair for sharing. So a few, nuggets about identity there and how, there is no separation of boundaries.
Please subscribe.
Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So, tech issues here. Okay, so, this whole idea of workism certainly is something we can all relate to. And without intentionality, we actually find ourselves that becomes the default. And we don't realize how deep-seated, it can become, from something that I'm showing up because I love to something that becomes something that I'm worshiping without even realizing it. And I protect this. Um, in the SakeenahMD space, we look at the impact of that on a day-to-day basis, and we develop this treadmill science framing and what that cycle often looks like because the work is everywhere and we're always catching up. We're always catching up on work. We're always catching up. We're always behind on the things that we need to do in other areas of our lives that matter. From worship, which can become mood dependent or even energy dependent, as some of you alluded to in the survey before this webinar. And then our families get leftovers. We have all these dreams for our children, but without focus, without attention, those things cannot be realized. And sometimes we forget to set up, work towards setting up ourselves so that that success is holistic as opposed to just in one area. And it's interesting, it's not just Muslims who have realized this. Many people have realized this. In fact, a leading author in the American popular literature Chris Christensen, wrote an article in the Harvard Business Review many years ago about how will you measure your life. And even him, these guys who are like big CEOs, talks about being intentional even from the get-go. Many clients, colleagues have shared with me that, some of what we're talking about here, we really need to try to get it in front of, uh, you know, colleagues who are still earlier in their career, whether it's in residency, even medical school, to start thinking about how to make decisions that are balanced in a sense and fulfill the haqq of the different areas of our lives. Uh, and this is not to say that there won't be times where there'll be more hyper focus on one area than the other, but that even in those moments, that we can find a way to still preserve our core identities and that work doesn't become the central organizing piece, and that we just give into it. And it's hard work. It takes a lot of intentionality. And we look at it in terms of four different archetypes that we've seen in our work here. We have the overextended healer. This is often somebody who is very much invested in their work, but caring for themselves is the last thing on the plate. They're still able to show up, on the performative aspects of them continues to be, look really good on paper, in fact, in front of people working with them. But deep down, they know that they're struggling, right? And then we have the spiritually hungry achiever, who's also looking really good on the outside, but it's that spiritual nurturing that's missing. Is that their salah, their dhikr, they're irregular, or they're there, the religiosity is there, but what some scholars call their spiritual sides, meaning the choices that they make, maybe in their interactions with uh, opposite gender at work, um, or how they're interacting with, the idea of billing, uh, overbilling. Several Muslim names have showed up in many of the Medicare fraud reports, unfortunately. So sometimes it's not just the quote unquote rituals of the deen that are missing. It's the true core, the inner aspects of what those things are supposed to unmask in us. And then there's the relationship bucket. Oftentimes it's those with children where we hear about the most. Guilt-ridden parent who is just struggling to be present at home. If they're lucky, maybe they have a spouse that's not working as much and they can delegate most of it to it. But that doesn't still absolve the individual of their own role in that relationship, in that dynamic. And then we have the exhausted advocate who is just killed by the system. Uh, so many things that are not working well in US healthcare. We're all very familiar. But in conversations I've had with colleagues, even outside of the US, it's not just the US. It's a problem everywhere. It's a problem in Nigeria. It's a problem in the UK and many other places. So how do you address these? If you can relate to any of these, uh, just identify which one. So the first one for the overextended healer, spiritually hungry achiever 2, guilt-ridden parent 3, and then the exhausted advocate, or a mix of them. Just drop it in the chat box. Okay. So Dr. Khan says 4. Anyone else identify, or are there some archetypes that we're missing? One, two. I've certainly identified with, I think, all of these at different stages in my career. And some days one was more of a struggle than the other. Yeah, I like to make it easy for everyone. But what I want you to walk away with is not just the identification, but that we can do something about it. Sometimes doing something about it requires just slowing down, maybe reflecting on how things are going. Sometimes that will be enough for some of us. Sometimes we need to talk it out with a friend. I have a buddy that I call my mastermind, and we just unload. Sometimes it's a mentor, somebody who's kind of been through the same stage we're navigating that. Sometimes it's a more formal relationship like a coach, but there's ways to navigate this with support. And that's where this ayah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, revealed in the Quran in Surah Al-Ra'd, verse 11, that we talked about earlier, Allah mentions this, that there is no change without us taking action, without us slowing down to what is possible and finding the resources to help to be able to navigate that change. And what we propose in the SakeenahMD space is that there's this idea of spiritual intelligence that Allah alludes to in the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Baqarah, وَمَنْ يَرْغَبُ عَنْ مِلَّةِ إِبْرَاهِيمَ إِلَّا مَنْ سَفِهَ نَفْسَهُ. That who would be averse to the religion of Abraham, alayhi salam, except the one who is not intelligent? We all know the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam, and the choices that he made, the very tough choices that he made, because he knew that in the current circumstances, he was not going to be able to fulfill his purpose of life. But Allah calls us and challenges us that if we want to be successful, that we need to lean into spiritual intelligence, the intelligence that helps us to fulfill the haqq, the trust of all of the roles that we have. There is the obvious one, our roles at work, because we're all here as healthcare professionals for the most part. But there is also the haqq of taking care of ourselves, that the Rasul reminded, some of his companions who just wanted to focus on worship. And then there's the haqq of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that we worship him, but that we also serve humanity in a way that is pleasing to him. And that translates to how we engage with our families, that they have a haqq that we have to fulfill, from our spouses to our children to our parents. And I struggled with all of this a lot, in my earlier years in training. Maybe would not talk to my dad for months just because we were both busy. He's also a physician. But it's important to slow down and recognize that we have to be intentional and to leverage what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed, his blueprints for us that the Rasul lived in his life, to be able to find that balance between fulfilling the haqq of all the things that are important and not just letting work trap us into thinking that that's the only thing and that that's the only identity we need to nurture. So what happens when you lean into spiritual intelligence? It's this idea of barakah. When we lean into spiritual intelligence, we experience this attachment of divine goodness to a thing by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that thing, when we lean into it, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does with this barakah is that it makes that thing to be more stable, or it makes it more consistent, or makes it more long-lasting, or there's a tangible increase in that thing. And sometimes it's not even tangible thing, sometimes it's intangible. As many scholars have described in terms of risk, for example, if you're fulfilling the haqq across all of your roles, as opposed to just work, if you're doing it just for work, you will see the work, obviously, growth will expand there. But if you do your best to fulfill the haqq of taking care of yourself, you will see the benefits. And that, inshallah, that will bring you back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because that is the whole full circle of barakah. It's not just that the thing becomes better, but it's that betterness is something that closes the loop and brings us back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we fulfill the haqq of our relationships, whether it's our children, our spouses, we see the same effect. When we do the same, especially with deen, we also start to experience that contentment. And so we see that when we lean into spiritual intelligence and start to experience this Barakah, then we're able to have a sustainable impact across all of our roles, as opposed to just the one-sided and skewed perspective that workism traps us into. And when you think about it more globally, in that video, they talk about hustle culture. But what we want to call all of ourselves too is what the Rasul Sallallahu showed us, which is, what Muhammad Faris described that as Barakah culture, right? Whereas in hustle culture, you have egocentrism, which is very much alive in healthcare. We're all driven to be personally successful. And then we focus just on our dunya, on material results often. We're never satisfied. We just want to keep going. And unfortunately, that also drives scarcity mindset and people are seeking credit. Um, and then we're always distracted, rushed, or have a sense of entitlement because I have this title. And then I'm thinking of how to pivot from where I am so that I can get to that next level of that ladder that was described in the video. But when we lean into spiritual intelligence and start to embrace Barakah culture, then our approach is more God-centered. We start to focus on a higher purpose, seeking impact, something that will fulfill success beyond just the next patient or the next position, uh, but something that's lasting, the everlasting, the focus on the hereafter, on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's acceptance, and that we will be content with the progress that we're making, not because it takes away ambition, but that it actually closes the loop on ambition, because we realize that the successes, the strides that we're making is all from Allah. While we need to continue to strive, that outcome, the success that we experience, the position that we've been put in as healthcare professionals is because of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that we need to fulfill the haqq of that. And we have an expansive, abundant mindset that my success does not impact the success of others, that we can all grow together. And then we start to be more present with everyone, with our families, with the patients, with the colleagues. And we have a sense of responsibility as opposed to a sense of entitlement. That sense that as a healthcare professional, there's a trust that I need to fulfill in my work. But then there's also my responsibility to others that I have to find a way to fulfill. And then that pushes me to start to think about things like boundaries and being more intentional. And that we can do this, we can make progress through small, consistent, long-term efforts, as opposed to quick pivots. Because the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is such that, transformation takes time.
Two things come to mind as time is.
And I'll just pause here before we listen to Sheikh Omar's brief reflection here. Any thoughts about this slide? Just drop a chat in the comments. Or if anyone wants to unmute, feel free to do that. A few more people have joined. Jazakallah khair for joining. Welcome. So just go ahead and drop comments in the chat box, inshallah. Any insights that came up as we were reviewing this? Yeah, that'll make it easy for all of us. Jazakallah khair for sharing. As one of our frequent attendees shared last month, she said that this requires a lot of work. And, we all have to be honest with ourselves. We can't just shift from one to the other and just turn on a switch. And again, we don't have to do any of that work alone. We can find help from the people just around us. Maybe it's people in the mosque, friends, mentors. Oftentimes, we have people who are aspiring to this in our lives, and we just may not be leveraging them enough. But there's also more formal help, for mentorship through coaching and all these other avenues. So again, highlighting um, that we can always find a way to move the needle, and that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees a slave making a step, taking one step towards him, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala runs towards that slave.
Two things come to mind because time is the thing.
All right, so let's hear a quick reflection from Sheikh Umar Suleiman about how our work can be a station of worship. And this is an important concept that we've been sharing in the SakeenahMD space because as healthcare professionals, we just spend so much time in our work that we can't let it go as just a mundane thing that we have to just check off. So let's take a listen.
What is our purpose? You spoke about the importance of going from pain to purpose, but could you just speak about what the collective purpose is? How do you see that?
So this might sound incredibly basic, but we go back to the basics. وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونِ, and I have not created man and jinn except to worship me. Our purpose is to turn our work into worship. Everything that we do, we frame it through the lens of ibadah. We are not a people that separate our lives and compartmentalize our lives. We are people that were taught that even our sleep could be worshipped, if it's for the intention to wake up energized. And so our purpose is to identify every single dimension of our lives and to seek to channel it into a form of worship, into a form of servitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Okay. And I'll just advance that reflection that Sheikh Omar Suleiman shared beautifully there at the Globally Empowered Muslim Summit earlier this year in Qatar. That our work and everything aspect of our lives, we really need to try to make sure that we're thinking it through the lens of worship. And that's spiritual intelligence. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in this ayah, وَمَا تَكُونُ فِي شَأْنٍ وَمَا تَتْلُو مِنْهُ مِنْ قُرْآنٍ ولا تعملون من عمل إلا كنا عليكم شهودا إذ تفيدون فيه. That, O Muhammad, and he's speaking to all of us, that you're not engaged in any matter. You do not recite the Quran. You do not do any deed except that we're witness over you when you're involved in it. And so for us in healthcare, because we spend an inordinate amount of time in our work, we just have to be very mindful that we don't have as many other opportunities to put things on our scale of good deeds. The healthcare station of work may be the main one for many of us. So my nudge to you here is to start to think about your work through this lens. And we'll share a path to doing that, inshallah. And feel free to, again, share any reflections that's coming up in the chat box there. And with spiritual intelligence, what I want us to also be thinking about is think of it as a frame that holds the other types of intelligences that we already have together in a way that helps us to have, do meaningful action as opposed to something that's just mundane. Clinical intelligence gets us through the door, right? It gets us to be able to see the patient, to do the things that we need to do. But it's often not enough. Very quickly in our careers, we recognize that we have to also learn about how to deal with people, the emotional intelligence. And then the spiritual intelligence helps us to be able to, connect the dots between what we're doing on a day-to-day basis in our work with what is more lasting, the akhirah. And that brings it full circle. But without that lens, and we just park it aside or compartmentalize it, then it's a huge missed opportunity. And so we came up with this framework to make it easier for us to be able to do that in healthcare, which is that we start to see our work through the pillar of amana, the pillar of that this is a trust that I have to fulfill, and it's an opportunity and it's a privilege that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has gifted this trust to me. So how will I execute on it? Two lenses to support the execution. One is the lens of ikhlas, uh, the sincere lens, sincerity, seeking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's pleasure and serving the people that I'm serving, from a place of sincerity, which can be very hard to do in the days, where we find ourselves in the busy modern lives now, where profit often drives many things. But what we don't realize is that when we do that, the profit will follow, but the profit cannot be the driver. And that ihsan, to do our best with it, to do our best for the people that we're serving, uh, is how we should be approaching this. Even if there is no layer of medical legal uh, imports and liabilities and all of that. Because when we have this framing around how we're working, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's audience, His acceptance, and Him as our primary audience becomes the driver for us showing up at our best. And that already takes care of all these other layers that, human beings, we have put on ourselves to try to make sure that we do good work. But half the time, it doesn't even work. But divine accountability is always going to be there. And as Muslims, we can't run away from this reality. And so the more we integrate their reality into the choices that we're making on a day-to-day basis, through the lens of our work as an amana, of executing with ihsan, and from a place of sincerity, and seeking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's acceptance of that work, then we can start to show up more through that lens on a more consistent basis. Not that we won't make mistakes, we will slip. It's just being human. But that when we slip, we'll come back to these Barakah culture concepts, the spiritual intelligence that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has taught us and guided us to in the Quran and in the Sunnah of Rasulullah, and that we will, inshallah, get back on track. And in a famous narration that I think about often is, this adhkar that Rasulullah shared with Mu'adh towards the end of his life, where, we are asked to make this adhkar at the end of every salah. Allahumma a'inni ala dhikrika wa shukrika wa husni ibadatik. That, oh Allah, help me to remember you often. How do we remember Allah in our work? Help me to thank you often. How do we thank Allah often in our work for the opportunities that we have, if we're not thinking of it through this lens? And help me to worship you with ihsan, if again, our work becomes worship and we're not thinking about it through this lens. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us all tawfiq, to be able to integrate these things into how we show up. And again, feel free to share in the chat box any thoughts, reflections that are coming up for you, inshallah. So the healthcare reality and the Barakah factor, right? For many of us, our clinician paradigm is such that we're always given. But that can be interfaced too often with low alignment. And when I say alignment, I'm talking about aligning ourselves or leaning into spiritual intelligence and being able to fulfill the haqq of, the key spaces in our lives, the garden of deen, of self-care, of our relationships, and not just the garden of work. And that will lead to misalignment and, in the worst case, burnout. But when there's high alignment, we can start to approach that Barakah paradigm where there's high output, we continue to show up with our best at work. But because we have a high alignment, we can be more able to do that work in a way that's sustainable. And that brings us to the Barakah gap model, where we should all be aspiring to the Barakah excellence, Barakah leader status in the top right quadrant of this graph, right? Because that recognizes in a place of high alignment, fulfilling the haq across all of our roles in life, and then we're able to perform well at work and across all of our roles again. But where we sometimes find ourselves is in these other three areas, where we may be a respected achiever at work, but there's that quiet burnout, not necessarily because the work of it, the work itself, but because the other areas in our lives are not getting the attention that they need. Or there's the survival mode where, because the other areas of our lives are not getting the attention that they need, we're not even able to perform and we're just surviving. Or there is sometimes, the example of some of the companions of the Rasul who just want alignment. They want a good life, high quality life, but they don't want to do the work of performing well. And what that just fosters is, a lot of guilt because you're just not able to show up at your best self. And so again, we want to aspire towards that Barakah excellence quadrant. So how do we get there? How do we realign? It starts with making an intention. Our niyyah is our compass. It's the thing that drives the actions that we take. But we need to make that commitment to ourselves that the status quo just cannot continue. And to slow down to this idea of intention, we look at the pyramid developed by Sheikh Suleiman Nadwi in his book Ethics in Islam, where he highlights that not every intention is built the same. All right. At three levels, we have, healthcare professionals can focus on just the worldly or the financial gains, or the honor and reputation that comes with the role, or even just the fact that I'm taking care of these people and it makes me feel good. But that's just not good enough, that's where we want to stay in our intentions. We need to aspire to something that goes beyond the dunya, to start thinking about the full circle of spiritual intelligence, of spiritual contentment that can come from serving others. Or that this station of work can inshallah get me to paradise, if Allah SWT accepts. But in the highest level is the level of ikhlas, where we're actually doing this purely for Allah SWT's pleasure. And may Allah SWT make it easy for all of us to be able to do that. In which case you will still have, inshallah, worldly, financial success. The reputation will come. You will still feel good, but you will tame that nafs to recognize that this success is from Allah and that it's not from us. And then we will, inshallah, stay in that zone of spiritual contentment and always seeking Allah SWT's acceptance, seeking paradise, and seeking ikhlas. And in one example from one of the early scholars, he was asked if you had to choose between praying 2 rakahs and going to Jannah, what would you choose? And in this famous narration, he chose to pray 2 rakahs. And he explained that a slave of Allah, a true slave of Allah, understands, to choose what is pleasing to Allah first before what is, what is their own immediate desire. But that's a very high standard. At the very least, we want to get to the point where we recognize our work as a station of worship, and that we're starting to see that it's something that can get us to Jannah, bi'idhnillah. Okay. So how do we nurture that intention? There's many ways, and I've alluded to this before a couple of times already, is that if I make a firm commitment today that this area of my life is something that I need to do something about, how do I move forward? Well, for some of us, just being in a space like this and just being able to slow down already gives me enough of the jump start. For others, I need to talk to a close friend. I need to find a mentor. I need to join a group where maybe there's a community online or in person where this is their focus, and I can, start to engage their content and make meaningful progress. But for others, it is something more formal in a coaching relationship. And before I go into that, I'll share this video from Dr. Atul Gawande. Some of you may be familiar with his work, and he explains this concept very beautifully.
How do professionals get better at what they do? How do they get great? And there are two views about this. One is the traditional view, that is that you go to school, you study, you practice, you learn, you graduate, and then you go out into the world and you make your way on your own. That's how doctors learn, that's how lawyers do, scientists. Now the contrasting view comes out of sports. And they say, you are never done. Everybody needs a coach. The greatest in the world needs a coach. So I tried to think about this as a surgeon. Pay someone to come into my operating room, observe me, and critique me. It seems absurd. Expertise means not needing to be coached. So then which view is right? Turns out there are numerous problems in making it on your own. You don't recognize the issues that are standing in your way, or if you do, you don't necessarily know how to fix them. And the result is that somewhere along the way, you stop improving. And I thought about that, and I realized that was exactly what had happened to me as a surgeon. So I asked a former professor of mine who had retired, his name is Bob Osteen, and he agreed to come to my operating room and observe me. The case, I remember that first case, it went beautifully. I didn't think there would be anything much he'd have to say when we were done. Instead, he had a whole page of dense with notes. Just small things, he said. Did you notice that the light had swung out of the wound during the case? Another thing I noticed, he said, your elbow goes up in the air every once in a while. That means you're not in full control. It was a whole nother level of awareness. He was describing what great coaches do. And what they do is they are your external eyes and ears, providing a more accurate picture of your reality. They're recognizing the fundamentals. They're breaking your actions down and then helping you build them back up again. After 2 months of coaching, I felt myself getting better again. And after a year, I saw my complications drop down even further. It was painful. I didn't like being observed. And at times I didn't want to have to work on things. I also felt there were periods where I would get worse before I got better. But it made me realize that the coaches were onto something profoundly important. I think it's not just how good you are now, I think it's how good you're gonna be that really matters.
All right. So, as I was reflecting earlier, we all need different levels of support. And obviously, we won't be doing any surgical coaching per se. But what I've found in my own journey is that coaches have helped me to be able to see a whole different side of myself that I was completely unaware of. So think of coaching as facilitated awareness. And it can be an incredibly powerful tool. And frankly, the more I reflect on the Rasul Sallallahu approach with the companions, the more I see it as the coaching approach. And here's why. There's this narration about, a young man who came to the Rasul Sallallahu that he saw this woman and that, he was drawn to the person and wanted to have sexual relationship with the person. The Rasul Sallallahu didn't just tell him, you better stop that. That's terrible. Can't do that. What the Rasul Sallallahu did was the ultimate coaching technique, which is reflective questioning, which is to ask him a simple question. If that was your mom, if that was your sister, would you want another person to do what you're about to do? And in that moment, that young chap, thought about it, and he developed his own awareness about what he was about to do and recognized that this was not the optimal approach and that this was not something that I really want to be doing. And so coaching provides a space where we can start to really refine that niyyah and get clear on our purpose. It provides that space for honest self-awareness, muhasabah. And then it creates the tools, it creates the sensitivity, it creates the urgency around course correction and making tawbah. Something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands in the Quran and that we often don't leverage enough, but is one of the most powerful tools that transformed the companions of the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And then we start to cultivate the muscle of istiqamah, the muscle of doing things sustainably, showing up constantly even when we don't feel like it. And that ultimately translates into ihsan in our service at work as well as outside of work. And that we become, inshallah, individuals living with a faith from a faith-first identity across all of our roles in life. And that's what I want to invite you all to today, is that we can all experience barakah that Imam Raghib al-Asfahani described as the attachment of divine goodness to a thing, and that when it attaches to that thing, it makes that thing increase, it makes it more stable, it makes it more constant, and it can be tangible and intangible. But it is something that, because of the nature of our own work in healthcare, we really can't ignore it. Rasul Sallallahu used to always make dua for barakah, and specifically he made dua for it in the early hours of the day. What this barakah does and spiritual intelligence is that it helps us to align our lives with what matters the most and not just be trapped in just a bucket of work. When we work with spiritual intelligence, we don't lose ourselves in service. We can actually find ourselves in it. And so we, alhamdulillah, created this space for healthcare professionals that I will share with you called Elevate with Barakah, the Resilient Healthcare Worker Program. And then for those of you who stick around long enough, I think in the last 15 minutes of that 9-minute block, we will go through a worksheet that can help you jumpstart your own journey, inshallah. All right. So we, alhamdulillah, came up with this Elevate framework, and it's 3 parts. We have, a stage where we help colleagues work through what we call the Barakah foundations in the Barakah activation phase. The core aspect of that phase of the work in the first 3 months of this year-long program is the idea of what we call the Islamic psycho-spiritual framework, mainly essentially understanding our nafs better and how we make choices, because that's often the crux of it. Our choices are informed by many different layers, from our beliefs, our values, our emotions, and all that needs to be unpacked. And then we go into how that impacts our choice around how we manage our energy, our focus, our time, our habits and routines. And then in the Barakah deepening phase, which is the following 6 months after those initial 3 months, we go deeper into what we believe to be the core areas of what we call core gardens of our lives. The garden of deen, the garden of work, the garden of health and energy, and then the garden of love, family, and relationships. So that over the course of those 6 months, we do some work in each of those areas. And everybody will be in different stages, during the course of their work. And that's fine. This is completely tailored to each individual. And then in the last 3 months, we really hone into Barakah mastery, which is that over the course of the preceding 9 months, the identity work has been evolving to an identity that's more God-centered, a true Abd of Allah, as Muhammad Faris calls it in the Productive Muslim work, a true slave of Allah. And we're making choices from that place, but we also recognize that sometimes we will fall. Sometimes we need to work on certain habits. Sometimes we need to course correct and develop that autonomy, that self-coaching muscle, and next level of clarity so that we continue to find our own next growth phase, whether we're in a program like this or not. And here's the structure of the program is that we do 2 live coaching sessions a month and then 2 optional implementation sessions because we recognize that healthcare professionals get swamped and their schedules can be all over the place. So we have additional space beyond those 2 spaces where we can provide more support. So potentially we could be meeting 4 times a month. And then on top of that, there is personalized coaching on a quarterly basis. And depending on need, sometimes we go from quarterly to as needed, just depending on the individual situation. And then there'll be access to recordings, resources, and then it's a very small group. We max at 10. And over the course of the program, inshallah, colleagues develop these Barakah rhythms that help them to have sustainable careers, but not that the career is the focus, but that their lives are truly full. And there's an investment aspect to this as well. So we have 3 paths to come into the program. We have the Barakah activation path, which is focused on that Barakah activation phase that I described earlier. And the current monthly plan is $9.97 a month. And then there's the Barakah Bridge program for those who want to experience the Barakah deepening phase to a certain degree, and that comes in at $9.37 a month. And then those who want to go really deep and experience the full transformation, 12-month, that's the core cohort, it comes down to $8.75 a month. And then in unique circumstances, we do have limited scholarships on a case-by-case basis. And for right now, the first 3, spots have already been taken, but we have an early enrollment bonus that we decided to extend, alhamdulillah. And so if you look at those initial charts, if you look at the total for those who did the 12-month package, it's actually at 10,500. But if you do enroll with this early enrollment, then you can actually lock it in for a much, much less, alhamdulillah. And then there's these additional bonuses for the first 3. Those have been taken, alhamdulillah. But the first 6, of course, get these additional courses that we've shared in the SakeenahMD ecosystem, and everyone gets a welcome gift. And here's what some of our clients have shared over the course of, the last 3 years that we've been doing this work, alhamdulillah. And then there's one video testimonial that I'll share with you all. Just a minute. All right, let's listen to Dr. Dantana, who's actually one of our current clients, and she's on the tail end of the program at this time.
Bismillah. Before I started the program, as I've told you already, I'd gone through a certain spiritual setback that made me develop this Allah consciousness. And so I was quite present with my deen. But unfortunately, career-wise, I was not, or I'm not where I wanted to be. So, and then coincidentally, I got newsletters, and then I found this program, and then I joined. What this program did for me was to redefine what success was per my terms. So it affirmed that notion that your faith, one's faith must be ahead of their career. And so ever since I am more fulfilled, I'm bolder. I, I I am more aligned in all areas of my life. Yes, and then I live with purpose. So before you have this compartmentalization of your life. Now I'm a Muslim everywhere. So what this program has helped me to do was to patch that identity leak I had. So you think about Allah easily, and then thankfully, effortlessly, you are becoming a more Akira centered. So Alhamdulillah, I can testify to the transformation and growth ever since I started this program.
Let you guys catch up on the rest in the follow-up notes. Just being mindful of time
I have.
so that we can do the worksheet, inshallah. A few days to keep in mind, the program is actually starting on the 2nd of August this time around, the 19th of Safar. That will be in the onboarding session, and then inshallah the first group coaching session will actually be on the 9th of August. And this program is not designed to be for quick fixes without any reflection. You must be willing to show up for your own growth and be open to trust in the process. So if you're looking for a quick fix, this is not a good program for you. Inshallah, those who are committed to sustainable transformation and need this level of support will absolutely would like to welcome you into our program. And one thing I'll point out from this FAQs list is the concern around CMEs. What I've found over the last few years is, especially after COVID, a lot of healthcare organizations have invested time and effort focusing CME reimbursement on things that impact your long-term wellness and well-being. And that's how we see this program, is that it's more holistic. It's not just focused on specific CME credits, but it's something that fits well under the CME priority and wellness priorities for many healthcare organizations. And if you have that option and you're thinking about it, or other similar programs, absolutely leverage your CME for that. And here is the two paths forward. One is if maybe you've been following our work all along and you're kind of already at the point where you're ready to move forward, you can scan the QR code on the left side and just go ahead, say Bismillah, fill the application form, and then we'll do a call with you to make sure that it's a good fit. The other option is the option on the right. For everyone that joins our webinars, we started, alhamdulillah, offering courtesy calls to our colleagues to support them because we know that this journey is not easy. Perhaps that's, the level of commitment that you're able to make at this time, but do make a commitment to yourself. And then I want to put a plug for the book that my mentor wrote, The Barakah Effect by Muhammad Faris, which really covers many of the concepts we discussed today. And I'll share in the follow-up notes a 15% discount code to be able to get your hand on the book. It's a very transformative book, and I will encourage anyone who has not read it to consider strongly getting it. And as we close, before we spend a few minutes on the worksheet, for those who are able to stay, my reminder is that you don't have to trade your peace for performance. You don't have to choose faith versus ambition. You actually can nurture both. You just have to have a path and the kind of support that helps you do that together, inshallah. And here's how you can find us online. We're on LinkedIn, YouTube, we have a website, and then a little bit on Instagram. And if there's any questions, please feel free to drop it in the chat box. And then for those who can stick around, we will work on a worksheet that I will kind of talk you through, inshallah.